Fantastic. I'm going to kick off today, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you very much for joining us today for this session with our very special guest, Roger Christie. Welcome, Rog.
Thanks, Ness.
Roger's a leading social media expert with more than 15 years experience in social media training and social media strategy. He established a business called Propel in 2013 following roles with Australia's largest social media agency and some independent communication and reputation management agencies. One of those was an agency that I worked in, and I'm very fortunate to work with Roger over the last 10 years or so and watched his amazing skills in practice, and it's wonderful to reconnect today. Roger's also very active in the industry, presenting at TEDx, advised the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and commentated regularly through industry conferences and media. He also facilitates a government digital leaders network around the country. This year, his business, Propel and Brandwatch, analysed more than 3 million tweets from and including Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, comparing public sentiment and emotions from January 2019 to June 2021, right in the heart of the COVID lockdowns and the pandemic. The analysis was the subject of a report, the Government Digital Media Report on Digital Reputation and Leadership Post-COVID. The insights were fascinating, and Roger's here today to share the learnings from that, but more so his practice over the last 15 years with our Commtract community. It's a fantastic opportunity for us. I think the issues of leadership, reputation, and how we operate digital and social media in the current environment is something that's top of all of our minds, as is the roles and the skills that we need to be able to do that successfully. So we're so delighted to have you today. In terms of housekeeping, welcome to our audience that have joined us. It's brilliant to have so many people interested in this topic. Roger's going to share his insights to start, but there is a question and answer box in the chat, and please put your questions in at any point in time. This will be live and we will be engaging as we go. We will stop to have those at some formal points, but please put them in as we go as well. Welcome, Rog.
Thanks, Ness, and thanks everyone for joining. As Ness has said, really keen to get into this today. It's one of those things that it's a passion of mine, I suppose, more than a profession, something I'm really passionate talking about, because I think particularly, as Ness was saying, the research that we did on Dan Andrews that looks at that window from 2019 to 2021, we all know we're all living it at the moment, but just the sheer volume or the amount of change that we've seen in that time period and the impact that has, particularly on leaders. But I think what we've seen is the flow and effect to organizations and the opportunity, the immense opportunity that sits at the feet of every communications practitioner to feel comfortable in this space in order to advise those that are looking to them for guidance at the moment. So that's where we're going to focus today. But as Ness said, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this all comes up on your end. We always hold our breath. And hopefully you can see building an online. Yes, excellent. Okay, wonderful. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move you around my screen because I can't actually see many of you, if any of you at all. I can see you, Ness, but that's about it. So I'll dive in. This is the key, I suppose, question that is coming from a lot of people today, which is, will a social media presence more likely defend or dismantle my hard-earned reputation? And I think if you ask that question probably, maybe even as recently as 2 years ago, but certainly 5 years ago, most leaders would be hearing, don't do it. Stay away from social media. It's not worth your time and effort. It's a place full of trolls and toxicity. It's something that's going to bring you unstuck. It's a place where if you say the wrong thing, everyone's going to hold you to account. These are the sorts of, I suppose, legacy attitudes that influence still today the decisions that a lot of leaders and their trusted advisors make. And the reason it's such an important question to ask is because in those past 2 years, the world has fundamentally changed for a range of reasons, but particularly in this context, it has changed the expectations that audiences have of the leaders in our society, and not just the expectations they have more holistically, but particularly in the digital environment. And where once, I suppose, the attitude may have been, well, look, let's just sit back here and let's let those conversations play out in their own way, in their own environment, but in an environment that I don't have to participate in. Nowadays, if you opt out of that environment, you opt out of the right of reply. So the simple answer to this question is, will a social media presence more likely defend or dismantle? The simple answer is it will defend, and it can do a lot more. And I'll explain how today. So let's dive into things. There's a couple of sections we're going to cover today. As Ness said, we'll stop at a certain point to run through more of that Q&A. But I want to run through what's changed in the environment, particularly over those past 2 years. I then like to talk about who's thriving. And please don't get me wrong, we've obviously got a time, a window on today's presentation. There's many more examples that I could go into, and in a lot more depth as well. It's just a shortage of time today, so we'll focus on a few key ones. Then I'd love to pause and just have a conversation, I suppose, around, if there's questions that come through on the chat, answer those around your own experiences and challenges, the things that you might be going through in your own conversations in your own organizations or the work that you're doing. We'll pause there. And then hopefully, if there's time, we can finish with some very practical takeaways, Ness. We'll see how we go. So the very first section I want to focus on is what's changed, because this is the reality facing every leader today. And it's important that we look at it in the context of today and not in the context of what was happening 2 years ago in a pre-COVID world. Because even though I've been working in this space for 15 years now, I think that what I've seen over the past 2 years is quite unique, and it requires attention. It's no longer good enough to say that the way things were is the way things are. They have fundamentally changed. So let's look at a couple of key proof points. Globally last year, social media users, so across the globe, not Australia specific, grew by 13.8%. If you have a specific channel interest, for example, if you take LinkedIn as a specific channel, the growth in that same time period was 14.2%. So this is something that we're seeing not just in the new and emerging, more millennial style channels. This is something that we're seeing across the board. And that's roughly two times the growth of internet users in that same period. If you look, I suppose, a bit more locally and say, well, what happened in Australia? Particularly in those early stages around COVID, well, we saw adoption or usage, the time spent on social media, going up by around 30% in the early stages of COVID. Now, that may not seem at all surprising, I suppose. If the physical world around a lot of people, a lot of consumers was shut off, naturally they gravitated into the digital environment. But it's important to remember, what does that then mean for our leaders today? What are the expectations on them? So this is where we shift our attention and go from, okay, there's many more people using social media today than there were 2 years ago. The time that they're spending on social media has increased than where it was 2 years ago. But what do they expect? How have their own behaviors and expectations in those channels changed? And how have their expectations of leadership changed? Well, there's a fantastic report that's put out by the Brunswick Group, which the Connected Leadership Report, if you'd like to have a look at the research in full. And what it is essentially telling us is that roughly 3/4 of people now expect leaders to use social media to communicate publicly. They're on social media. They are spending more time on social media. They expect leaders to also spend their time there, because that's where they are. That's the environment that they're living in, that they're living and breathing, where they're getting information from, when they're getting ideas, where they're learning different points of view, where they're forming their own opinions and making decisions. And if those leaders aren't there, it does present a risk. We only need to look at that through one lens, which is again from the same report, looking at talent attraction and talent retention. Staff would now prefer to work for a leader who is social by more than 5-to-1 ratio compared to one who is not. And the simple truth behind that is, if they can see a leader online, they can learn about that leader, they can learn about their values, their culture, the way that they support their team, their colleagues, who they interact with at a partnerships level. They can see a lot more about that person. They can learn more about that human being. That leader's visibility is a talent attraction tool. And those leaders that are invisible are the ones who will miss out, basically out of sight, out of mind. And if we can see that more and more people are spending time online, this is the importance of building that online brand, that digital brand. The last point, if you want to talk directly to risk and what do leaders stand to gain or lose by having an active presence online. This proof point, by the way, doesn't talk directly to social media. It's simply talking about speed to respond. And I'll explain where that fits in. So for an organization that responds to crises within hours versus weeks, the impact on their share price reduces by roughly 10.5%. So what that means is, for any listed organization, anyone who is at the mercy of the market, so to speak, if you have channels that provide you access to your key stakeholders in a very timely manner, It means that when something goes wrong, if you have existing brand equity, existing connections, existing relationships, and existing expectation from those audiences that this is where you can and will communicate, you are in a far better place to respond than someone who's caught off guard and is relying on a third party like the media or even other partner channels to get that message out. So it's really important that we consider the impact of our brand, not only as what we say and do, which could present risk, but if we're not there at all, what great risks that presents. So what does this all lead us to? It leads us to one central truth, that good leadership has never been more visible than it is today. And I would argue it's never mattered more than it has today, given the societal expectation, the pressure that's happening in the world around us at the moment, obviously with what's gone on through COVID and the pressures that's put on people. People are looking for good leadership. People are looking to be inspired and encouraged and motivated. And they're looking for leaders across all aspects of life, not just those traditional sources of authority or those at the top of the tree. This presents a wonderful opportunity for leaders. And the report that Ness was talking about earlier, this is something that we spent a bit of time on in recent months, looking at the single behaviours of Daniel Andrews, Premier Daniel Andrews, during the pandemic. Now, not because we necessarily think these learnings apply to political figures only, or that they apply to individuals only. There's more to take from this report than just that. The reason we focused on Dan Andrews was what leader faced more or greater scrutiny, particularly in 2020, than Dan Andrews in terms of what he had to endure through Victorian lockdown, 175 days. For those that are tuning in from Victoria, we really feel for the experience that a lot of those people had. And he was sitting at the front of that, turning up to media briefings every day and facing a lot of criticism online. So our thinking was, if anyone copped a lot of criticism online, if anyone was at the mercy of the Twitter trolls, as it were, then it was likely to be him. So political persuasions and all that aside, we just wanted to see whether his digital brand had any impact on his positive or negative perceptions in the market. And as it happened, there were 5 really interesting findings that came out of our report. The first one being that effective digital leadership is actually a magnet for positivity. So rather than assuming that he would attract all sorts of negativity, positivity and positive sentiment towards Daniel Andrews actually went up during the difficult period of COVID, compared to the 2019 kind of control analysis period that we were looking at. The second finding that we found was that institutions without the human face were the ones who actually faced the real risk. If you think of your own behavior, and if you ever had a flight cancelled, or you've ever been frustrated at a telecommunications company, where do you go to vent your frustration? And if it's not social media, that's fine. But if you have gone to social media, it is a lot easier to rant and to yell and to get upset with a faceless institution than it is a human face, someone with a story, someone with emotions, someone with kids, someone with pets, someone who you can connect with. It's institutions without the human face that actually face the real risk. So leaders, the third point here, can actually connect, reassure, and energize far better than any institution can. Why is that? Because we're humans. Social media is a human medium. It was never designed to be a brand medium. If you look back at Facebook and its origins, the reason Zuckerberg set it up was to connect with the opposite sex, essentially. So it's really about human to human connection, not about brand connection. That's changed over the years with advertising. But if you think of it at its core, what this environment provides us with opportunities to do is to connect on a human level. And again, if you come down to the fourth point, citizens are therefore far more likely to rage at institutions. This was a number that really surprised me, because I think you expect there to be a certain level of criticism leveled at institutions, but we essentially saw that level of anger and frustration increase twofold, while Dan Andrews actually improved that number. And I do encourage you to go and have a look at the report in full if you'd like to see some of those numbers behind it. And the last point, and this is the point that I want to leave you with, is a known and established digital brand is an invaluable crisis asset, counter to preconceptions. Having that existing profile, having that existing brand equity, as we talk about it in the digital environment, is the thing that will set you up for success when times are tough. That does not mean having a platform where you tweet or you post every single day into a vacuum. It's about active participation, having a community of peers, people who are trusted, credible, third-party individuals. Because when times are tough, those are the relationships that you're going to lean on. And as we've seen through those early data points that I shared, that environment, the place where that is playing out now, that environment is digital. So if you don't have that even wonderful legacy of offline brand and reputation converted online or translated online, that's where these battles are being played out. So if you don't have that presence, you're in a real position of risk. So what does this mean for leaders? Well, it's quite simple. If you want to look at it in terms of a formula, participation equals protection. We talk about this in the sense of, well, avoidance actually equals risk today, whereas people putting their head in the sand in the early days of social media was seen to be the norm. Particularly, again, one of the reasons why we looked at Daniel Andrews is we were interested to see what the government response would be and the applications would be for those working in the public sector. For any leader today across any sector, participation is protection. If you think about your own reputation, would you rather have control and have a say in the discussion around your own reputation, or would you rather leave that in the hands of others and leave your own reputation to the mercy of others and their views of you? This is the opportunity that presents every leader today. Your digital brand is essentially the thing that dictates what comes up on Google when people search your name, and you want that to be sharing the best version of yourself. So this is all well and good in terms of the theory, in terms of the numbers, the data that we now have, and particularly that report, which goes into a lot more detail. But who's out there doing it well? I think it's really good to look to industry and say, well, what examples of inspiration can we get? Who can we go and look to see who's doing it well even? And what can we learn from their own behaviors? Now, as I said right at the start, we've literally handpicked a couple of examples. There's plenty more to draw out, particularly global as well. I think I'd encourage you all to look further afield as well at your industries offshore and see what others are doing in that space. But I'm just going to focus on 4 today. The first example that we'll talk about is Victor Dobbinello. Now, there's any number of examples I could include about the work that Mr. Dobbinello does. What I find particularly interesting in the example that's on the screen in front of you is the way that he controls his narrative and the way that he is proactive on things that I think other leaders would rather stay out of the limelight for. So in this case, he's talking about his Bell's palsy and what happened while at a very public, I suppose, media briefing, and the concern that people had and the impact that that had on him and his health. And what's important about this is not that Victor Dobbinello is just out there saying, you know, here's what happened, which I think is unique in its own right, him sharing an update on what was happening. That's not the only thing that's unique. He's then using his own digital brand as a way to stamp out disinformation and misinformation that's spreading around, and particularly at a sensitive time like COVID vaccinations, to stamp out any of that wrong information and correct people in a timely manner. He's listening to conversations, he's responding to them directly, and he's ensuring that the truth is the thing that is circulating online, rather than leaving that in the hands of others who could speculate. And this is the thing, if Minister Dobbinello did not have this profile online, that does not mean these conversations would not be going on. By having this presence online, he is able to have a voice in that discussion, and even through his own network, build third-party credibility and advocacy around what he's doing and what he's saying. So it's not just one voice against the digital masses, it's an army of people and advocates who can vouch for his credibility. So he's an interesting example to look into. Another example from government is Amy Brown, who works was the CEO at Investment New South Wales. And again, there's many examples that I could point to with Amy. There's 2 that I want to reference here on this slide. One is the way that Amy brings her whole self to her digital brand. And the reason why I'm sharing this example in particular is because I know a lot of leaders working in the public sector often find this a little bit uncomfortable. How can I bring my whole self when I still have my duties as a public servant to perform? There's nothing wrong with talking about issues, and you can do that in an apolitical way that keeps things very safe and secure, given your position of power within the public service. And so what Amy does is uses her digital brand to connect with others, to share, to show that she is feeling and living and breathing the same experiences that they are, and makes it much more human and much more relatable. Why that's important is, if we come across to the right-hand side, the example it sets for others who are watching. So by talking about this concept of languishing, for example, what she's not saying is, oh, I'm just having a whinge. What she's saying is, I understand the environment that we're all living in, that affects everyone. And that's that empathy that can come across and can scale in a digital environment far better than it can in the hallways of any office. And when offices are closed, far better than you can do through one-to-one Zoom conversations. So what she's able to do is then set an example that others who might be watching see and think as a good example of leadership and something that they want to be a part of. And in this case, I noted that it led to the attraction of one particular candidate who's a very energetic and high-performing individual who was attracted to Amy over other places of work because of the example she was setting, because of the way that she interacted with partners, the way that she interacted with her staff, the respect that she showed them, the platform that she gave them, those qualities of leadership that we're all looking for and that many leaders do enact on a one-to-one basis. Amy's been doing that at scale in a searchable environment, and that's something that will help attract the right talent, who are the sorts of people who are going to come in as a graduate and essentially start talking about former secretaries, building relationships with chief executive officers of the Greater Sydney Commission. These are the sorts of people you will want in your organisation, and it's your leaders that can be the magnet for talent. The third example I'm going to talk about here is Andy Penn at Telstra. And again, a very different tone here. Why am I sharing this example about the ACCC settlement and their treatment of Indigenous customers? What's interesting about this, again, is in some ways, I think a lot of leaders would prefer to use their online reputation to be, all rose-colored glasses and to say that the world is far better and prettier than it is. What Andy Penn does is, again, a bit like Victor Dobbinello, he controls the dialogue to a degree, and he also uses it as a really good accountability measure to say, this is what I stand for. This is the bar that I set in terms of the culture that I want to instill across my workplace. And he's setting these messages not just to staff in a LinkedIn environment, mind you, but also to shareholders, also to partners, also to customers. This is what I was talking about earlier in terms of good leadership has never been more visible. He could have sent this note in an email. He could have done it as part of a media interview, but he's chosen to take to his own LinkedIn profile to talk about not just once, not just twice, but then responding to comments as well about the way that they were treating Indigenous customers, controlling that dialogue, putting a stake in the sand and saying, this will no longer be good enough. It never was good enough, but we're certainly going to change our behavior. And even the response that you can see on the top right here, the comment from a former licensee and talking about the poor culture and the poor behaviors that were going on at the time. He's not shying away from that either. And he's saying, really sorry to hear about your experiences. We are making changes. And that's the least, the very least you can do is to reply to people and ideally try and turn a negative situation into a positive one simply by showing you're listening, that you're taking things seriously, and that you're using that as an opportunity to improve the way you operate. No one is perfect. And I don't think we need to present our digital brands as anything different. The last example I'm going to talk to is Amanda Yates, who works at Transport and Main Roads in Queensland. And why I think Amanda is interesting, again, for the similar sorts of things as Amy Brown at Investment New South Wales, she does bring her whole self into work and brings her whole self onto her digital brand as well. But what I want to drill into here is the way that she's using social media in unconventional ways, I suppose you'd say, particularly from a public sector perspective. She, on the left-hand side, talks about the activities that she's involved with, but particularly highlights a lot of the partnerships, the relationships that she has, events that she's been to, and uses LinkedIn as a way to strengthen and reinforce and elevate and give airtime to those partners, which is a really powerful tool. I think a lot of leaders, when they come into this online space, they just think about what they can do, what they need to say, how they need to turn up. It's really important that we remember there's the social in social media, and it is about the community. It is about the relationships that we keep and the way that we support and elevate others, particularly as leaders. There's a great story about one particular leader who, rather than waiting for people to connect with them, on LinkedIn, would proactively reach out as the CEO and connect with each individual staff member. And the message that sent to individual staff members who had just joined the team to know that their CEO was there, that they were listening, and that they cared enough to spend the time to reach out to them. Just think about how you would feel as an individual joining that organization. And the last example on the right here is something that's very common at the moment. We've talked about the great resignation, the great attrition, the great reshuffle, whatever you want to call it. There's apparently going to be a lot of talent movement over the next couple of months, as there does tend to be at this time of year anyway. What Amanda Yates is doing is using her LinkedIn profile to take what it would be a standard or stock standard job ad and turning it into something which is much more her, much more human, much more relatable, much more engaging, much more personal. And so, yes, you can still click the link, and there's a link in the comments. You can click the link and go through to the standard job ad for Queensland Government, or you can watch the video where she explains what that person will be doing, who they'll be working with, and provides a much more valuable and human insight into that. This is the power of creating that digital brand equity. Not only is it seen by, in this case, over 4,000 people, it's also getting others within her network to share it with those that they know who may be well suited. Not just a standard job ad with the old Seek label logo on front of it. This is a much more personal experience and behind the scenes look at how things operate at transport and main roads. So Ness, I'm just going to pause there. I appreciate we covered a lot of territory in a short space of time, but I know there's a lot we wanted to get through today. I just thought I'd pause there. If you want to look at a Q&A, if there's anything that's come through, if there's any questions that's raised with people, very much welcome them based on your own experiences.
Roger, that's fantastic. And I mean, what you've shared is a significant amount of information in a really short amount of time, which we're really grateful for. Personally, I found the 31% linked increase in kind of usage of LinkedIn and your other figures there over the last year, like just phenomenal. But I think it's fair to say we've probably all lived and seen that migration online. I had a question, and I think the audience shares that question. So thank you to Karen and Julie, who have asked this in various ways, is what you've showcased for the leaders are really great best practice examples. I think for many of our listeners and anyone that's been in a leadership role, the biggest question is, how do they do it? Like, how do they find the time, the capability, the planning? Do they do it themselves? Do they have a team that does it? What have you learned from working with organisations about how they get it right for their leaders to engage on social?
It's a really good question. And you're probably not surprised that there is no one answer. I think what I've been surprised by actually is some leaders actually don't want help, in the sense that it's not that they wouldn't want any assistance at all, but they see it as, this is a very private asset. It is my asset. It's something that I'd rather people not play around with, because it is such a crucial component of their professional reputation. So I think that's something that has surprised me, is the level of the level of control that some leaders want over their own personal brand. And fair enough. And I respect every leader's perspective on that. In terms of where you can help and what do most leaders do and what sort of support do they get? If we take an example like an Andy Penn, so you would have people like that who are working at the top of a very large, many thousands of employees organization. In this case, leaders like that, and I can't talk to the intimate details of Andy's setup, but leaders like that, and Victor Dobbinello, again, in terms of the size, often what they're doing is they're working with communications professionals to set the agenda in terms of the communications themes and the topics, the key messages that they want to cover on a regular basis. They're having those briefing discussions to learn what's out there in the market, what are people talking about, what was their response to the last thing we put out. They're getting that sort of support from their communications teams to know what's going on out there and what can we put back out into market and where. In terms of the granular activities, the who is posting, who is responding, who is sending connection requests, all those sorts of micro activities, that does, what I found, it does depend on the leader's own levels of comfort. In some cases they outsource quite a bit, and really the only involvement that they have is review and approval. That's not my recommended approach. The way that I look at it is anything that has a one-to-one touch point should be owned by the leader themselves. There is nothing wrong with planning and developing content in a group, or having someone write content that you then review, put in your own language, vet, whatever it is, before it goes out. There still has to be that level of vetting and approvals. But anything that has a one-to-one level of connection should be managed by the individual themselves. Why? As soon as you post something out into social media and one person comes back with a question, you need to understand context about that person and your relationship with that person in order to say the right response back. And I know firsthand, having worked with a fairly senior figure in one of our major banks some years ago now, that exactly that scenario happened, where they were very well trained on how to push messages out. But then all of a sudden, as soon as one came back in, they had no idea what to do. And the message went up the chain to say, how do I respond? So you've got to make sure that those roles and responsibilities are defined to avoid any major or mild panic mode like that. But what I'd recommend is at least work out what jobs you can outsource that you can take off your leader's plate. And providing they're spending 5 to 10 minutes a day, that might sound ridiculous, but 5 to 10 minutes a day in the authentic engagement, the reviewing and responding, if they're doing that at a very minimum level, it will sell itself. And those leaders will learn to spend more time in this environment when they start to realize the power and the impact of what they're doing. Get help on the big things, work on the small things on your own.
Very wise advice. Very wise advice. I think what's fascinating, looking at those examples that you gave and what you're speaking about, is over, the last 5 to 10 years, how that has really moved to almost an organic part of leaders' roles. I think, moving from a very highly structured and protected social media environment to one where everybody knows that somehow they've got to have a role, and has ventured into doing that. And what we are seeing is some of our leaders emerging to be doing that in a very sophisticated way. Stella had a great question, which I think is on many of our minds as well. Like, how do you start? Like, should you overhaul what's there? Should you just and start with a blank slate, or should your leaders just, literally start somewhere, or should you get really planned about it? Like, what have you seen work in terms of overcoming that first hurdle of engaging in social media in an effective way?
Yeah, if I can share an industry example is a good way to frame that journey. So he's not in this pack, but Shane Elliott at ANZ Bank, I think, is a great example of someone to look at in his journey and why he's taken the steps he has and where he is today. So I'm assuming everyone knows who he is, but I'm assuming most people would be aware of some of the social media activity that he's done over the past few years. It's interesting to note that in some of his early interviews, what he talks about is being somewhat more of a digital recluse and very reluctant to get into social media, because he's not one of those people who leads from a platform, from a soapbox. He's very much more in the servant leadership kind of persona. And that doesn't naturally translate in social media. I think leaders have got this confusion that to participate in social media means I need to have an ego and I need to always have an opinion on things. Yes, people are looking to you for guidance and advice, but that doesn't mean you need to be driven by ego and soapboxes. So what's interesting about Shane is that he started in a very reluctant place. And the thing that drew him onto social media, and the thing that still maintains his level of individual participation today, is the customer. He realized that if he wasn't going to opt into this environment, if he wasn't going to understand this environment, then he would be missing out. He would be less informed. He would be less aware of what his customers were living and breathing every day, and therefore the role that the bank had to play in their lives. And so he made a personal choice against his own, I suppose, personal preferences to invest time in this environment. And in doing so has been drawn into it and spends a considerable amount of time from a leader's perspective, and someone who manages a large bank spends a considerable amount of time investing in that environment because he's recognized the importance of it. So I think my simple answer to that is find out what matters to your leaders and find the linkage point between that and building a digital brand. Never try to sell anyone on social media, never, ever, ever, because it just doesn't work. I've learned that the hard way and certainly am smarter and wiser for it. But I think rather than talking about the merits of social media and data points and how great this new platform is, those conversations won't work. Instead, finding out what really drives and motivates your leadership team, find out what they're passionate about, and then you can go two ways. You can go the route of listening and intelligence, providing them with data from communities who talk about those sorts of issues in the social media environment, what conversations are going on in LinkedIn, what conversations are going on in Twitter, bring that information to them to show them what's happening out there. Or in the case of, the Shane Elliott's of this world, who are the key audiences that I care about generally, and what are they talking about? Do I have a view on that? Do I have any awareness of what's going on in their lives? So yeah, my recommendation would be let their values and let their interests guide them into the digital environment rather than forcing it upon them.
Fantastic. There was certainly a lot of fear early on, Roger, and I think you touched on it there in terms of if I dip my toe in, then, that's going to create a kind of chain reaction, which if you are a leader of a large company, on your mind are your shareholders and your corporate reputation heads and everybody else. What have you seen, I guess, change in the structures around social media to enable our leaders to be so authentic and organic and actually, I guess, allowed to type when it comes to those platforms?
Yeah, it's funny that there seems to be a general rule, isn't it, which is the common sense rule that applies to anyone on social media. And it's fascinating that sometimes leaders aren't trusted to have common sense online. So, read into that what you will. But I think what's changed is the recognition that if we opt out of this environment, we're actually opting out of a lot of the opportunities. And so if we need to participate, the question is no longer, well, do we or don't we? Or how do we kind of control this environment? The question becomes, how can we support our leader to succeed and to thrive in this environment? And this is the really important question today. Participation in building a digital brand isn't about setting a content calendar, arming that leader with messages and having a schedule, very, perfected schedule of when things are to go out at certain times, and then posting things out on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and then just waiting for the responses and trying to weed out any nasty ones. That's not a recipe for success. In fact, that could even present more risk than opportunity. What we encourage all leaders and particularly their trusted advisors, those that are supporting them, to do is to look at things more holistically. It's not about your profile. It's not about just posting information out there. It's about having a more holistic view and understanding of what a digital brand constitutes. We talk about a plan methodology: profile, listening, activity, and network, PLAN. We talk about having those 4 things covered. And so what you can do with leaders is then do a lot of the listing that gives them intelligence, and so they can understand what's happening in the world around them. Do a scan of their network and understand who are the key strategic partners that they need to be connecting with and communicating with on a regular basis online, rather than being at the mercy of whatever comes through their LinkedIn feed. Do those simple things like optimizing their profile so that when someone Googles their name, they don't see an egg as a profile photo. They see something which is, far more reflective of who they are as a human being. So these little things you can do to support your leaders. And I think what we've learned is that, again, it's no longer a question of if, it's a question of how. And so how is all about putting the right structures around people to ensure that they feel comfortable, they have confidence, they know what to do, and they can do those things that they've agreed to do. And they know they've got a team around them who can help them when they can't do it, when they don't have capacity. I think there's a really interesting example that's not in here that I'd encourage other people to have a look at. And again, views on fossil fuels and climate change and anything like that to one side, purely looking at the example of Bernard Looney, who's the CEO of BP. And if you have a look at Bernard's profile, what's really interesting at the bottom of his profile, he talks about, and Victor Dobbinello does this to a degree too, he talks about the fact that his profile is managed by multiple people. Yes, it's him talking, and yes, it's him sharing content, but others do review his messages because he simply can't get through the level of comments and replies that he gets, but he believes that they're all important. So if you look at that, in his case, what he's done is recognize the importance of this channel as a way to engage with the audience. And it's really interesting to look at what he's doing, by the way. But then he also acknowledges that there are things he can't do. And he and his team have built a workflow and a support structure around him that means that other people receive that information. They obviously prioritize the comments and replies that he needs to focus on, and they leave the others, recognizing that, if he replies to one, he'll answer maybe 10 questions and answer those key ones and leave the others for now. So again, there's things, those workflows and structures like that you can build around your leaders to make it sustainable for them that are just essential today. It's like no other, it is like every other communication channel. You've just got to work out how it's going to suit your leader, the workflows that you can build around them to ensure they feel supported and can respond in a timely manner.
Brilliant. I think that I want to move on to your specific recommendations, and I'd encourage certainly more questions, but I think the most critical part of what Roger has done in his own practice is, I guess, turn the theory that we know at a high level into practices. But before I move to that, I want to know, what is the one thing, do you think, that has influenced leaders from being reluctant to being active on social media? Have you seen a tipping point for leaders when they've actually gone, great, I've got to get a handle on this? Like, is it ambition? Is it fear? Is it something that happens in their business? I would love to hear what is that tipping point for those of us that might be influencing leaders to engage and to invest the time and capacity to do it well.
It's a really good question. And the reason I'm smiling is my immediate thought was COVID. COVID was the tipping point, as a lot of people have joked about with digital transformation more broadly. I think that the answer you touched on a growth and ambition mindset, and you talked on a fear and a confidence mindset. Now, I mean, confidence in the kind of negative, having a lack of confidence and insecurity. So there's almost two ends of this spectrum. Both are very important drivers, but both have a role to play depending on your leader. For those that work within a more conservative, risk-averse environment, obviously that fear and insecurity is the thing that can drive a lot of people. And the message that I'd really like to say to people working in those environments is, don't assume that social media and digital participation equal risk, because the opposite is true. So I appreciate that is something that has many, many layers of history wound up in it. But if you can start to unpack that, recognize that avoidance equals risk, not participation. It's about doing participation well. There's a big spectrum of participation, but I can guarantee you the one way of doing avoidance is fraught with danger. So that's at that end of the spectrum. In terms of growth and ambition, yes, there are absolutely leaders who look at this as an opportunity to increase their profile, to increase their impact, more importantly. And I think they're the sorts of leaders who have seen the power of this through COVID and recognize that if I couldn't use the standard town hall style channels, how could I reach those same audiences? How could I build new, valuable, strategic partnerships? I can't do it when the physical world is closed off without access to the digital world. And so that's the thing that's been driving a lot of leaders' activities online. And to be honest with you, whether they sit at this end around fear and insecurity, or whether they sit at this end around growth and ambition, find examples. Find examples out there from others in industry doing this, because we know that social media is not new. We know that most of these channels are 15 to 20 years old. Yes, there are some emerging ones, but these are not new channels. Find examples of others in a similar space or with a similar mindset, a similar size organization, whatever it is. There's plenty out there that you can draw from to help inspire and give your leaders confidence that others have already walked this path and there's things to be gained from it.
Fantastic. Sean's got a great question. I mean, we've talked a lot about leadership presence on social media, but his question is your advice on how to improve online reputation for organizational accounts. You said, I guess, in your own stats, people are more likely to rage against the organization. How do you create that kind of human connection and that element to organizational accounts if it's not the CEOs?
So the first thing I'll say is your leader is a way to protect the reputation of your organization. So they are intrinsically linked. I think that's one thing that has changed over the past 5 years. We previously looked at them quite individually. And for some reason, I honestly can't tell you why. Maybe it is the advertising dollar. Social media was always seen as the domain of the brand, not of the individual. We know now that the strength is in both working together. There is much more upside for the individual, but the strength is in them working together. The individual leader, Andy Penn, can't do customer service in the same way that the Telstra social media or Facebook page can do. Like, the scale will never be there. Both have an important role to play. I think what I'd say about how do you protect and build the relationship, the reputation of your brand online, know what your benchmark is. Know that you're already starting from a different base compared to an individual, and know that whatever your given industry is, you're starting at a different baseline compared to other industries as well. Often we can look to, because all this information is so freely available, we can look to examples of, it might be more retail, more FMCG, more fun, more vibrant brands out there who are doing some really fun and creative stuff. And you go, why can't we be like them? Why, they seem to get so much positivity. How come we can't be like that? The reality is that not all of us work in, activewear space, or we don't all work for coffee or, things that are much more welcome, names and voices and pieces of content in our feeds. We don't all work in that space. Some of us work as regulators. Some of us work as from a taxation perspective. And sometimes you just need to reset your expectations. Know your benchmark. Know what it is or how you track based on the metrics that are obviously important to your organization, and then monitor that over time. And my advice to anyone, regardless of what industry you work in, at an organization level, keep your ear close to the ground. Know how people respond to the messaging that you put out there in the market. Know how they respond to the level of service you provide and the responsiveness that you provide them in those channels. And the best way to see an uptick in that sort of benchmark is to, one, ensure that your content is of value to people, and that comes from listening to them and understanding their pain points. And then 2, delivering it in a relatable, it doesn't have to be human in terms of fun, memes, gifs, all that sort of stuff, but in a relatable and accessible way. And I say that having worked with a lot of government agencies, I know often get caught up in their own legalese, not for want of changing, it's just that social media is treated the same as other official channels. And breaking that down can be an incredibly effective way to improve your relationships with customers or with citizens. And the third thing, as I was saying, the third thing around the service element is simply make sure you've got the right resourcing for social media. I think often there's a bit of a preconception maybe, or a misconception that social media is easy to manage. It's fast, it's simple. We know that there's a lot of organizations who perhaps don't put the time and effort and resourcing into managing that at an organizational or a brand level. I'd highly encourage you to look at the volume of information coming in, the breadth of that. Often it's 24/7, not 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, wherever you work around the country. So making sure you've got the resourcing levels that are appropriate for the demand coming through on the other side, and test and learn, continue to test and learn, continue to resource up. But yeah, make sure the content is guided by intelligence, make sure that the delivery is relatable and accessible, and make sure that the service or the level of service matches the expectations of the audience. And they're 3 very simple ways that apply across industry.
Fantastic. Well, I'd love to move on to maybe your summary, because I know you've done a lot of practical work, and I think a lot of the questions we have is you're moving beyond the theory to, like, you know, how do we actually do it?
Yes.
It'd be great to kind of get your top 10 tips for that.
Sure, and we have actually, you know, which is great. Some of the questions that have come through did answer some of the points that I'm going to cover off here. But the main thing I would say, and again, if we come back and just make sure we're focusing here on the leader and those people supporting the leader, how to succeed. There is no one formula. Please keep that in mind. Each leader is different. Their own mindset, their own attitudes, their own comfort levels will be different. And each organization and its culture is different, and the operating environment that you're working within is also different. So there's no one size fits all, but these 10 steps, I would argue, are going to set you in hopefully a better, if not a very good direction going forward. So the acronym that I was sharing earlier, the plan, the PLAN, your leaders do need a plan. Everyone needs a plan. And the reason we've got this iceberg motif on the page is when you think of profile, listening, activity, and network, so profile being what people see on the surface, listening being the sources of information that you're keeping plugged into to make sure you're informed, activity being every little micro moment that you do online, and network being the company that you keep. If you look at plan, essentially the tip of the iceberg is your profile. It's really important because it's the one thing that people always see above the surface. So when someone goes and Googles your name, what they don't see straight away is your network. What they don't see straight away is your activity. What they will see, and they certainly don't see what you're listening to, what they will see is your profile. And hopefully, if you have a digital brand and you've maintained and curated that digital brand, they'll see the right things. They'll see a description, an about section that talks to them about who you are and what you stand for. They'll see a profile photo that reflects who you are. They'll see a complete profile that harnesses the full features and functionality as per a Twitter profile or a LinkedIn profile. The classic example on LinkedIn is featured content. So many leaders don't use that feature on LinkedIn, which is a really helpful way to demonstrate a more human side to the leader. Amy Brown is a good example of that, where she has videos of herself talking direct to camera, just talking about her own values and beliefs. It's a really helpful way to cut through a lot of the corporate noise. So that's your profile. That's what people see when they Google your name, but it is just the tip of the iceberg. The real weight and value and substance of your digital brand comes through the other three aspects, being listening, activity, and network. So I'm going to reference, as Ness said, I'll summarize this in 10 points, and happy to have this as a leave behind for others to help kick start or maintain momentum in the work that you're doing around your own leaders' digital brands. But hopefully these 10 points will resonate or give you something to think about. The first thing, and we have touched on this, is get help. Leaders should absolutely get help. They're not alone, and they shouldn't have to do this all on their own. And I completely appreciate, particularly the early stages, if you're starting from scratch, the amount of time that is involved in getting things right, getting the foundations right. So that may mean doing that research, doing those listening exercises to know what people think about you, your organization, your leadership team. Do those foundational pieces with the support of others. and make sure that you're then building workflows and systems that build on that in a sustainable way for your leaders. Profile changes, we talked about that. All those pieces that don't involve the one-to-one engagement can be done with a support team. The second thing is showing Google who's boss. Don't leave your reputation in the hands of others, and definitely don't leave it in the hands of an algorithm. Do whatever you can to ensure that you control your digital real estate, and that your presence, your profile, the thing that is showing up on people's screens is what you want them to see. The third point is curating a meaningful network. This is one of those areas where I think a lot of people overlook it. People often worry about what they're saying. What they don't often think about is the company that they keep. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone's got, live grenades sitting in their network somewhere. There's not that sort of issue of people who are going to present problems for you down the track, but often it can just be a random collection of people that you've, gathered along the way. In some cases, we've worked with people who was ex-girlfriends, ex-partners, things like that, and they go, I haven't spoken to them for 15 years. Just make sure that your network reflects the sort of person you are, the caliber of your expertise, and also the interests that you have, because your network is your most powerful asset when it comes to a digital brand. Believe it or not, it's not profile, it's not listening, it's not activity, it's your network, and then knowing how to harness it. The fourth point here, commit regular time and effort. This can be one of the biggest challenges for leaders. And that's why we say as little as 5 to 10 minutes a day is a good way. And I think particularly as more of us start to travel, or there's more dwell or downtime, we can use those moments to, particularly on the mobile phone, and do make sure your leaders feel comfortable using these channels on a smartphone. You can use that time in the taxi, in the Uber, whatever it is, to actually, even on the bus on the way into work, use that time to get up to speed on things, providing the foundational research is done, and providing that your network has been curated and it is now reflecting those people that you are interested in. That time you spend will be very, very valuable, and algorithms reward that consistency. Steps 5 through 7. Know what you stand for. So if we consider the first page about being the basics and getting those things right, this is much more about the strategy. Know what you stand for as a leader, and algorithms, and also, fellow human beings. We don't want to hear from the corporate mouthpiece. We don't want to hear the same scripted messages that might come out or might be more appropriate for other channels. That's fine. Social media is social. It is about a dialogue. It is about building relationships and trust with other people. So know what you stand for, know what you feel comfortable talking about. We in Propel, we talk about a North Star concept, knowing what it is that you're, why you're here, what drives you, what motivates you, what you bring to any conversation, because that is very different to what an institution can talk about. You have your own experiences, your own background, your own stories, your own very unique journey to get where you are today. Harness that. Use that, because that's what people will relate to and what will connect with them, which is really important when you then look at point number 6, which is knowing who stands with you. There's this concept of digital diversity, which is there is strength and safety in numbers, because there's strength in working alongside a leadership team. Please don't ever look at this as there is only one official voice for our organization on social media. That is fraught with danger. Not every leader is going to resonate with every audience. And not every leader can listen to every audience. By having diversity in your leadership team and in your digital presence, you are strengthening and protecting your brand against potential risk, incoming risk or inbound risk, but you're also setting yourselves up for success by having many, many different entry points into the marketplace, particularly in a COVID world, where you can start to build relationships based on individuals with different backgrounds who will resonate with different people. That's really important. Know who's standing with you and know how you can work hand in hand. And the last point on this page, which ties into that, is listen broadly and purposefully. Don't just focus on your leadership names, or don't just focus on your organizational brands. Focus on the issues that matter to the key audiences of importance to your leaders and your leadership team. Very much focus on the issues that they're passionate about, because those are the things that are going to help you deliver an informed, a sensitive and empathetic message into market, and more often than not, reduce the risk of doing so. The final 3 steps. We often talk about risk and security, some very simple steps you can take. And if there's nothing else you do off the back of this conversation, I would encourage you to go and review your privacy and security settings of your leaders. If you are a leader, do it yourself by all means. Go and look in the back end of each of these profiles to make sure that you know what information you are sharing with the public social web. A classic example of this is a lot of people don't recognize that there is one simple toggle within LinkedIn that makes your connections visible or invisible. And the reason this is important is that if your network is visible and you've just collected a random assortment of people along the way in your LinkedIn network, essentially what you're saying to anyone who is part of your network, they can access any one of those other people. We all change jobs, we all move industries. What could essentially have been a colleague or an ally at one stage is now actually a competitor. So please, if you do nothing else, go and check those settings and make sure that you're setting yourselves and others, those in your network, up for success. The last thing I'll say on this point is each leader, as I was talking about before, Ness, each leader has their own preferences, and in this case, their own levels of comfort. Some people love to share stories about what they're, particularly with the the summer season ahead of us, what they're doing on holidays, where they're going, how they're spending time with family. Some hate it and would never want to talk about anything family related. The important thing is to have the conversation, understand that leader's level of comfort, and understand the associated risks with sharing information about either where they're going on holidays, information about their family. We've seen too many examples where leaders' private information has been shared unwantedly. You need to understand, or perhaps unknowingly, it's important to understand their own level of appetite. Learn the science, know how the algorithms work. This will be the thing that makes a difference between whether your time is well spent or not. I cannot stress that enough. The algorithms are crucially important because they will be the make or break factor often. Don't share a post on LinkedIn, for example, write your own, because otherwise you're going to get next to nothing reach. So simple things like that are going to make a big difference. And the last point here, growing your network and advocates. Continue to invest in your people. I've already said that the network is the kind of hidden gem within your digital brand. Make sure you continue to invest in building the right people around your leaders. Make sure they are connected with strategic partners because these are the people that they want to be seeing on a regular basis. These are the faces and comments that are going to be popping up in their feeds that the algorithm will surface. You need to use these digital environments and digital smarts to provide you with information in a timely manner to help them make informed decisions. So I think that's everything, Ness. Yes, they're the top 10, and I'm happy to share that afterwards too. I should have said. So if people want to get more information, or if they have questions off the back of that, by all means, please do reach out. Oh, we've got you on mute. Sorry, Ness.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I might just close the screen. We did have a couple of final questions. Roger, firstly, thank you. That was brilliant. Is there anywhere that you would recommend, obviously, besides this webinar and your own, I guess, experience where people can learn more to become familiar with the platforms and the advice that you've given today? What are the best resources that you provide? Yeah, look, I think you're right. If you're at the point now where you're either hitting a sticking point or a stumbling block, whatever it is, as a barrier, something that you can't get through, and you've been fighting this battle for a while, I would absolutely encourage you to seek a second opinion. But if you're on this journey and you're either just finding your way or you're looking for a few additional ideas, spend time in these environments. It's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day. What I would encourage people to do, use LinkedIn, use Twitter, use Instagram, find examples of leaders and what they're doing out there, because that will be the thing that provides evidence, and that can be a catalyst for a conversation with your leadership team. So by all means, do go and look. If you've got a particular leader in mind who your leadership team respects, or an organization they respect, go and see what they're doing online and use that to start a more constructive conversation. A very effective way to do that for those who are comfortable and familiar with Twitter, go and look at a senior figure within any given industry and see if they are on Twitter lists. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry, I can't go to it right now, but it is a valuable tool. If you know what Twitter lists are, go and look at those and go and find people who are active and participating online already. It's a way to shortcut your research and see what others are doing online. Brilliant. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Roger, for joining us today. It was a fantastic report. If you haven't had a chance, we'll share that with everyone along with the slides from today. I'm sure Roger's happy to be contacted by anyone as well. He does provide consulting services in all sorts of formalities, but also very, very generous with sharing your knowledge and information. And we thank you for that. Thank you for everyone that made the time to join us today. We really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you all soon.